So you want to know about overtime laws. Maybe your employer didn't pay you the overtime that you deserve. Or maybe you're not sure if you deserve to be paid overtime in the first place. Well, you're in luck. I'm an employment lawyer, and in this video, I'm going to break down the laws around overtime. By the end of this video, you'll know which employees must be paid overtime, which employees are exempt from the overtime requirements, and what to do if your employer failed to pay you overtime. So stick around. This video is for legal information and educational purposes only. Nothing in this video is legal advice. Furthermore, I'm licensed in Washington State, so the laws that I'm talking about are the laws of Washington State. But overtime requirements are also in federal protections, specifically the Fair Labor and Standards Act, which is applicable in all states. So if you hear anything in this video that sounds like it might apply to you, it likely does, and you should talk to a lawyer in your jurisdiction. If you're in Seattle, Washington, or around Seattle, Washington, you can feel free to contact my office. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get on with it. So what does the law say about overtime? Well, to understand the law, we should first look at the law. And in Washington State, the overtime requirements can be found in Washington State's Minimum Wage Act. Specifically, we'll look at RCW 49.46.130 subsection 1. I'll put that up here. The law states that no employer shall employ any of his or her employees for a work week longer than 40 hours unless such employee receives compensation for his or her employment in excess of the hours above specified at a rate not less than 1 1/2 times the regular rate at which he or she is employed. Now I have to laugh because that statute, like most statutes, is a big word salad. It barely makes sense. So let me break it down a little bit for you. So essentially, the law providing overtime simply requires employers to pay its employees 1.5 times their hourly pay for any work beyond 40 hours in a week. So if you work 40 hours in a week, that's a normal work week, and you get paid your hourly rate for those 40 hours. But if you work 41 hours, that one extra hour, you get paid 1.5 times your regular rate. And any hours beyond that also get 1.5 times your hourly rate. So any work beyond 40 hours in a work week, you get paid overtime, 1.5 times your regular rate. That's the law. That's the overtime requirement. But overtime comes with a few exceptions. Not all employees get overtime. So let's talk about those exceptions. So overtime laws get a little bit confusing when we start talking about the exceptions because there's a ton of exceptions. But of all the exceptions, there's basically two primary groups that most of the exceptions fall under. There are additional exceptions that we're going to go over in the next chapter, but first let's go over those two primary groups. First, we have the white collar exceptions. Second, we have the exception for independent contractors. Let's go over each. So the white collar exception includes executive workers, administrative workers, professionals, computer professionals, and outside sales. Now each one of the white collar exceptions comes with its own criteria that must be met in order to be exempt from the overtime requirements. I'm not going to go over all those criteria here because it's really complicated. Instead, I'll just give a brief and general overview of what courts look at. Generally, the white collar exceptions apply to workers that make substantially more than minimum wage, and the threshold is anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 times minimum wage, depending on the size of the employer. And the worker's work involves significant discretion. They decide what they do. They have the power to hire or fire people. They manage employees. Their work might involve an advanced degree or specialized knowledge of some kind. For a more detailed description of each of the white collar exceptions, check out the link in my description. I wrote a guide to unpaid overtime, and I go over each one of these exceptions in detail. The next exception is the independent contractor exception. Now, independent contractors are exempt from overtime requirements for a different reason than the rest of the workers that are exempt. You see, overtime requirements apply to employees, and under the law, independent contractors aren't considered employees. So overtime requirements don't apply to independent contractors because they're not employees. So who is an independent contractor? Well, independent contractors are those individuals who are in business for themselves. In determining whether someone is in business for themselves, courts examine whether the employer has control over the person's work, whether the person uses their own equipment in their work, whether the employer or the person determines their profit or loss, and how permanent is the relationship between the person and the employer. For example, as of making this video in November 2021, courts have agreed that Uber drivers are independent contractors and not employees for those criteria that we just listed. Uber drivers own their own equipment, their car, they decide the hours they work under their own control. And whether the Uber driver makes profit or loss depends on the Uber driver's own initiative, not the employer. So courts all agree that Uber drivers are independent contractors and not employees. Now, this area of law is very contentious and it's constantly shifting. So if you're not sure if you're an independent contractor or an employee, talk to a lawyer in your jurisdiction. Now, I said I'd go over the other exceptions, and we'll just go over them really quickly. Workers who request time off instead of overtime. Persons employed as seamen on international vessels. Seasonal employees of agricultural fairs. Unionized motion picture projectionists. Certain truck and bus drivers. Agricultural workers. Certain airline personnel that swap their shifts with other airline personnel that puts them over the 40-hour limit. Volunteers, newspaper vendors, forest protection and fire prevention, inmates, Washington State ferry crews, individuals who sleep at their place of employment, commissioned employees that work at retail or service establishments, commissioned salespeople who sell cars, trucks, RVs, campers, trailers, manufactured homes, or farm implements. So under what circumstances do overtime violations usually occur? Well, here are some common issues that arise in overtime violations. So what if your employer classifies you as a white-collar worker when you're really not a white-collar worker? One of those exceptions that we talked about before. Well, that's a misclassification. And if your employer isn't paying you overtime, you would have a claim of unpaid overtime. What if you work more than 40 hours in a week, but it's not all in the same calendar week? The answer is that overtime still applies. In Washington, a work week is a fixed set of time of any 7 consecutive days. It may begin on any day, at any time, and it's not required to coincide with calendar week. Rest periods are the next issue, and rest periods are part of your working hours. In Washington, employers must provide non-exempt workers 10-minute rest periods for every 4 hours worked. Now that rest period might not sound like a lot, but if you have a lot of employees who are non-exempt, who aren't being paid for their rest periods, that can add up to a lot of unpaid overtime. The next issue is meal breaks. Meal breaks are sometimes part of your working hours, but not always. If an employer requires an employee to remain on duty while taking their meal break, then their meal break is part of their hours worked. However, if the employee is free of all working duties while they're taking that meal break, then that doesn't count towards their hours worked. The next issue is on-call time. In Washington, whether an employee's on-call time is considered hours worked depends on a few factors. If the worker has to remain close to the employer's premises, such that the worker can't make use of their own time, then that time is considered working hours. However, if the worker is not required to remain on site and is only required rather to inform the employer where to reach the employee, that time is not considered working hours. The next is travel time. In Washington, generally, time spent traveling to and from work is not considered working hours. However, under certain circumstances, travel time can be working hours. Courts consider the following factors in determining if your travel time actually constitutes your working hours. Whether the worker is using a company vehicle, whether the worker must respond to company calls while traveling, whether the worker is permitted to make personal stops, whether the worker must maintain contact with the employer, and how often the worker receives assignments at home that they need to research and write down and map out. Now finally, what happens if a worker waives their overtime and agrees not to be paid overtime? Well, the answer is that overtime is mandatory, so you can't waive overtime. Even if the employer thinks the worker waived their overtime, the employer is wrong. However, employees in Washington do have the option of taking time off instead of overtime. But employees have to take one or the other, overtime or time off. They can't just waive it. So what do you get if your employer fails to pay your overtime? Well, in Washington State, employers who failed to pay overtime are liable for the following types of damages. First, unpaid wages. Second, attorney's fees. And third, the employer is liable for double damages if their violation was willful. Unpaid wages is the amount of overtime you should have been paid but you weren't. Attorney's fees are the fees that your attorney accrued while investigating and prosecuting your claim against the employer. And willful violations exist when your employer knowingly withheld overtime. Now, if the employer withheld your pay because of a genuine dispute, that doesn't count as a willful violation. A genuine dispute might arise if your employer claims that you owe him a debt and he held the wages because of the dispute over the debt, as an example. However, if the employer withheld wages because it misclassified the worker as exempt when the worker's not really exempt, that is a willful violation, and the worker can get double the amount withheld. That's how double damages works. So now you know how overtime laws work. If a non-exempt worker works more than 40 hours in a week, their employer must pay them 1.5 times their regular rate for every hour over 40. If you think your employer improperly withheld your overtime pay, contact a lawyer in your jurisdiction. If you're in Washington State, feel free to reach out to my firm. My website is in the link below. And remember to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I release weekly videos explaining the laws that protect workers. And share this video with other workers so that they know the options available to them.